Ladies and gentlemen, we have one more keynote for you, and this is by the president, the former president of the Republic of Colombia, Iván Duque Márquez. Please, let's see his keynote.
Let me express my thank you to President Sung, President of Yonsei University, and also my deepest gratitude to my good friend, former Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon. It is a great honor for me to participate in this amazing panel, in this amazing event, where we are reflecting about the future of the Sustainable Development Goals. As I have said multiple times, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals can be grouped into three great subjects: climate action, or sustainability. The second one is social equality. And the third one, sustainable and inclusive growth. Those 17 goals that today are the reference model of development planning can be grouped into those three subjects. But today, I just want to concentrate myself in talking about the present and the future of climate action around the world. And basically also contribute to the discussion by saying that the challenges we face are not small. Why? Because the first great obstacle that we face in terms of climate action, it's about the resources that are available fiscally in multiple countries to attend their needs. Primarily because, as the IMF has pointed out, the world faces an average debt to GDP ratio of around 99%. That means that on a continuous basis, inside government cabinets around the world, there is a constant debate of about what penny goes to education, what goes to health, what goes to housing, and what goes to climate action. And if we don't allow the climate investments to take place in an accelerated way, we might not get to the idea that we have all focused in, which is that by year 2030, we must have a reduction of 45% in all the global emissions. So the question is, what can be done? And on those fronts, I just want also to reference that two things are needed, especially for those poorer countries around the world. We need to accelerate and create mechanisms of debt to climate action swaps, which means that efforts that are done by impoverished countries in terms of climate action can also be linked to the pardon of debts. That means to swap the climate action for the debt that those countries have concentrated. That requires a lot of technical overview and traceability, but it's a must. And the other thing that is needed is that, especially for middle-income countries that need to accelerate most of their climate action policies, there needs to be an agreement with the IMF so that the necessary fiscal investments that are required in the next 7 years towards the 2030 agenda can have a great amount of those investments to not be counted under the fiscal deficit lines. That means that those investments will be below the fiscal deficit calculations. Obviously, that implies that there cannot be a moral hazard and that there's no free lunch in terms of what the countries are committed to do. There needs to be traceability. There needs to be a very clear following up daily on those policies. But it is a must that the IFIs think and address these very clear two needs. The other element that I want to highlight is that if we really want to have a carbon neutral and nature positive planet, we need to accelerate the 30 by 30 initiative, which means that by the year 2030, most of the countries in the world shall have at least, at minimum, 30% of their territory declared a protected area. That can be possible if there is a political willingness, as it happened in Colombia. During my administration, We started with the 14% protected areas that we had in our nation, and we left it at 34% before 2030, and in fact in 2022. So if countries follow the example of Colombia, we will be able to secure the largest amount of protected areas ever in our history. And that obviously includes also maritime territories, where we have to acknowledge that practices as trawling can basically destroy the coral reefs, which are the home of 45% of all the life in our oceans. People are not aware that the destruction of the coral reefs every year releases almost the same amount of carbon dioxide as the aviation sector. So if we protect maritime areas and non-land territories, we will be effectively contributing to the climate action that is needed in terms of nature positiveness. But this also implies that we need to mobilize resources. And that's another element that I want to present before you. We need to accelerate the carbon credit markets around the world. We can't see the carbon credit markets as an activity that does not have a sound construction in terms of their value and in terms of their capacity to mobilize resources, specifically to communities that participate on conservation and also on the offsets of carbon emissions. Definitely, we need to strengthen the auditing capacity, the validation capacity, the evaluation capacity. But the carbon credit markets need to be reaffirmed as a mechanism in which we can mobilize resources for climate action and at the same time monetize resources for those communities that engage in these type of practices. We propose that in order to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, a more modern, more straightforward, more reliable, more trustworthy carbon credit needs to be developed. And there are great opportunities happening right now. For example, the Africa Carbon Markets Initiative, where multilateral actors, where IFIs, where important foundations and also governments are highly committed on creating projects that benefit the whole society. I also want to highlight the importance of the acceleration of the energy transition. We need to move forward and rapidly for non-conventional renewable energies, but that does not happen overnight. And we need to have a transition that is sound, responsible, and that guarantees the energy security for the countries in the world. That also implies that incentives need to be brought to the fiscal and especially the tax policies, and that we can also allow communities to participate in projects such as smart grids and also unifamiliar solar panels that can address primarily in non-connected areas around the world as a mechanism to close the gap of not having the access to electricity. We also need to make a big push on clean mobility and expand like no other time the car park of individuals, but also public transportation and cargo. Colombia, for example, in just 5 years, became #1 country in Latin America with a public fleet of vehicles that are run by EVs. And the same with cargo fleet. And today, actually, the individual density of electric vehicles is something that demonstrates that good incentives can accelerate this process. We need to think about low carbon agriculture. We need to think about silvopastures. We need to create an umbrella in those communities in need to say no to not clean ways of cooking, but allow them to have affordable energy. And we need to protect high altitude ecosystems. We need to protect the Amazon. We need to protect national parks in Africa. And we need to protect jungles in Asia. If we see the 4 most important spots in the world to preserve biodiversity, we need to accelerate the investments and the mobilization of resources. Otherwise, we will not be able to complete the Sustainable Development Goals. We need to think smartly on green finance. We need to think smartly on having green taxonomies where countries can have the glossary of all their activities and that the investment in ESG is done in a very transparent way. If we do this, we certainly will be able to address also the impact that climate change has on multiple countries, primarily because of the effects of natural disasters. Good climate intelligence to predict elements of nature derived from climate change that can harm societies need to be addressed, and that requires the application of AI technologies. We must see cities as the place where the highest concentration of efforts must take place now. And this involves waste management. Also work on waste to energy solutions. Think of cities like biodiverse cities where all the activities are aimed to protect biodiversity. That the stress that cities create on water are addressed. That we also tackle elements as coastal erosion. And that we guarantee that there is a conscience of citizens to also reduce their individual carbon footprint. All these elements are necessary to address the roadmap of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Without a secure, decisive, well-funded climate action, we won't be able to close the social gaps, and we will not guarantee that there is a sustainable and inclusive growth. In all these activities, the private sector must play a role. We cannot erode the capacity of the private sector to keep on generating solutions. And our entrepreneurship models are required. But they also involve the requisite of having states that guarantee legal stability, legal security, and promote in an effective way the possibility of having new corporations, seeing them grow, generate employment, and transform individual technologies. I think this event is a great opportunity to make all these reflections. And Mr. Secretary Ban Ki-moon and President Sung, if we work today on identifying debt swap mechanisms for the impoverished countries so that they mobilize climate action and they can get their debt write-off based on effective traceability of climate action projects, we will advance. And also, if we allow for middle-income countries to have climate action investments that will not be counted under the fiscal deficit for quite some time, before 2030, we will also release an amount of resources that is required today. But most importantly, we need to look at all these green investments, not as a complementary way of living. There is no possibility of having a more egalitarian or a more sustainable growth society if we don't guarantee that climate action based on carbon neutral and nature positive solutions are built. Thank you very much for this opportunity. And as I have expressed it many times, my commitment to work on all these efforts with the Yonsei University and with the leadership of former Secretary General of the UN, Ban Ki-moon, is always there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.